going to take a couple of seconds to do an introduction. It's a more extensive introduction than many, but I think it sort of will help us all get on the same page with the amazing Kristin and Chris. I'm going to read from it, which I know is not that polite, but I just want to make sure I get all the words right. So, some things go really well together, like peanut butter and jelly, wine and cheese, yin and yang, and Neff and Germer. So we're so lucky to have them here, converging from in the Midwest, Kristin from Austin and Chris from Cambridge. I'm going to introduce them each individually. So first, Kristin Neff. Many of you know her. She's a total pioneer in the exploration and excavation of the whole domain on self-compassion. She has a background in communication and human development and is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. It was in Kristin's postdoc work and her exposure to Buddhism and insight meditation that turned her towards the work on the study of self-compassion. She was first to publish a paper on self-compassion in 2003, and importantly for anybody who's a researcher, she developed a very valid measure which has been used extensively in research all over the world. According to her 2017 Vita, and so I know these are understated, her website, selfcompassion.org, receives around 100,000 visits by 60,000 unique visitors a month. Her 2011 book on self-compassion has been translated into multiple languages, and it's become basically the foundation text on self-compassion. She and Chris co-created the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which has evolved into the Center on Mindful Self-Compassion, a best-selling workbook on self-compassion, and now a new training manual for people interested in teaching mindful self-compassion. In fact, they told us at lunch that they've trained over 100,000 people and 5,000 teachers. Is that right? Did I get? Oh, 2,000 teachers. Oh, yes, 2,000 teachers. That's right. And along with her other books, articles, podcasts, TED Talks, she's tilled the soil for a whole field of work on self-compassion that is so needed in today's world. Now, Chris comes from a different place. Chris Germer comes from the place of psychotherapy. He's used mindfulness and self-compassion as part of his practice for over 30 years. This is the fun part for me. Chris attended Colby College with me many years ago. We graduated together in 1974. That's okay. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Temple University. And like Kristin, he has been and continues to be a prolific writer of books for people practicing and teaching mindfulness and compassion. In addition to the 2 books with Kristin, he's authored other books including The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, Wisdom and Compassion in Psychotherapy, and Mindfulness in Psychotherapy. When not writing, he has an active clinical practice and lectures on psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School, as well as being a founding faculty member of 2 centers that I want to make sure I get the name right. On the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy and the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion. It's part of the Cambridge Health Alliance and Harvard Medical School. Luckily for us, Chris and Kristin met at the Mind and Life retreat at the Institute for Meditation Society and birthed their dream of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. In 2012, their dream became a reality. The center is a place where people all over the world can learn the skills in self-compassion, find out how to train on it, continue to practice MSC skills, and how to teach MSC to others. They offer all kinds of different ways of bringing this work to the world, which is, again, we're learning from them as a center about how to spread the word on things that really make a difference. So it is our honor and such a thrill that they are here. They're going to teach a 2-day workshop, and they came in, starting tomorrow, they came in a day early to have these occasions to interact with all of us. So please join me in welcoming them.
I'll stand. Is this on? Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having both of us. So I do research on self-compassion, but for me, it really is a personal journey. I found out about self-compassion. It was actually my last year of graduate school, finishing up my PhD. It's all right. And basically, I was a basket case. I had just gotten divorced, and I was feeling a lot of shame. It was all very messy. And I was also under a lot of stress. I wasn't so much stressed about whether or not I would finish my PhD. I thought I probably would, but as some of you may know, would I get a job after investing 7 years of my life into this endeavor? So basically, I was feeling very stressed. And I was in Berkeley. So literally down the street from me was a meditation group. There's lots of meditation groups in Berkeley. And I had heard that meditation was good for stress. So I went to the group to learn meditation. And the very first night I went, the woman leading the group, she was talking about compassion, which I kind of expected. But she also talked about the importance of self-compassion, about how especially when we're struggling or we're stressed or we're going through a difficult time, we need to turn inward and give ourselves the same sort of care and support and understanding that we would naturally give to someone else we cared about. So I tried it, and I was just amazed by the immediate difference it made. The simple act of stepping outside of myself and saying, Kristin, you're having a really hard time. Is there anything I can do to help? That simple act of perspective taking immediately made me more able to cope with my stress. I was more resilient, and it really helped me through a difficult time. And so for me, it continues to be primarily a personal practice. But luckily, I did get a job after getting my PhD. I did 2 years of postdoctoral study with one of the country's leading self-esteem researchers. And so I'd actually like to start my talk about self-compassion by looking at something that may seem similar, but it's actually quite different, and that's self-esteem. So what is self-esteem? Self-esteem is a global evaluation of self-worth. It's kind of a judgment, a positive judgment of oneself, or maybe a negative judgment of oneself. Am I a good person, or am I a bad person? And as you know, for many, many years, and in many cases it's still the case, self-esteem was seen as the ultimate marker of psychological health and well-being. Tens of thousands, probably at this point, of books have been written about the topic. That is, by the way, an actual cover of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Self-Esteem. Lots of books written for kids as well. And there's a reason for that. It's because we know people who have high self-esteem have more psychological well-being. They're less depressed, they're less anxious, and if people's self-esteem is really low, they might even consider suicide as a way out. So we know self-esteem is linked to well-being. However, there's a lot of problems with self-esteem. It's not so much whether or not you have high self-esteem, it's how do you get your high self-esteem, okay? There's kind of healthy and unhealthy ways of getting self-esteem. So one of the biggest problems with self-esteem is to have it, we have to feel special and above average. I mean, don't we think about it? If someone tells you something you care about that you're average at it, you're going to feel insulted. It's not okay to be average. And so at its very core, self-esteem is predicated on a logical impossibility because we can't all be special and above average at the same time. So that's a problem. So how do we manage this? Well, one of the things it sets up is this constant social comparison. Like, how am I comparing to Chris? How's his book selling compared to mine, right? Things like that, right? So we're constantly kind of predicating our sense of self-worth on how do I compare to that person over there. And that constant social comparison actually, first of all, it disconnects us from other people, and it can lead to some nasty consequences. For instance, bullying. We know, why do early adolescents start to bully? It's because they're developing a sense of self. They're starting to develop their sense of self-esteem. They don't have a lot to go on at this point. So one of the ways I get my high self-esteem is by picking on that other kid. You know, whether it's physical bullying or more relational aggression, picking on, spreading rumors about other people. All that nastiness actually stems in part from the need for high self-esteem to feel good about ourselves. And of course, it doesn't end in adolescence. If you think about prejudice, now prejudice is complicated. It also has to do with power. It's not a simple thing, but at least part of what's going on is if I can feel that my racial, political, religious group is better than yours, I feel good about myself, right? So this is something that's pernicious at last. Another problem with self-esteem is narcissism, right? So some researchers claim that the huge focus on teaching self-esteem in the schools actually led to Generation Me, a kind of whole generation of narcissists. And we know that, you know, if you've ever dated a narcissist, I don't need to tell you, it's a problem. People who are so invested in their high self-esteem, they can't even see reality. You know, they're constantly blaming you because they need to protect their high self-esteem. Another problem, of course, is perfectionism, right? And we see a lot of this in business contexts, in school contexts. It's not okay to be less than perfect. You know, for instance, I teach a lot of undergraduates. The ones that come to my office hours aren't the ones getting the B. It's the ones getting the A-. It's not okay to get an A-. They have to be absolutely perfect. And so, you know, the problem is if you have to be perfect to feel okay about yourself, you're never going to be perfect. So it creates a lot of anxiety, just trying to get it right, And of course, we're human beings, so by definition, we can't be perfect. So this creates another problem. And then probably the biggest problem with self-esteem is it's contingent. It's contingent on success. So the three domains in which people most commonly invest their self-esteem is peer approval, social approval. And by the way, it's not like how much do my good friends and mother, how much does my mother like me? It's like how much do the other people at work or the other people at school, what do they think of me? It's a very kind of lousy source of information because you don't know them and they don't know you. And yet our self-worth is predicated on this. Perceived attractiveness, especially for a woman, very important determinant of self-esteem, and success, whether it's financial success, athletic success, etc. And so what happens is on good days, we feel good about ourselves, but when we fail, precisely when we need it most, our self-esteem deserts us, right? You might say self-esteem is a fair weather friend. So in other words, it's there for us in the good times, but it's not there for us in the bad times. And our self-worth can be really unstable. And some psychologists even argue that instability of self-worth is more problematic than how high or low it is. And so basically, you know, the end result of the self-esteem game, you can call it a self-esteem game, it's like a treadmill we're on. It's an unwinnable game. We are always going to feel inadequate because A, we are not perfect. We're human beings. We're always going to, you know, we aren't going to meet our own standards. We aren't going to meet the standards of others. And there's always someone doing it better. So it was as I was, you know, researching and learning about self-esteem in my postdoctoral studies and the problems with it. And in my personal life, I was practicing self-compassion, which is kind of, you know, being a good friend to yourself, especially when you're down, especially when you're suffering, especially when you feel like a failure, that I thought, wow, self-compassion is a really kind of nice alternative way to have a sense of self-worth that's not based on judgments, but is simply based on human kindness. So what is self-compassion? Right? So in many ways we can think of it in this simple way. It's just treating yourself with the same kindness, care, and concern that you would show to a close friend when they were struggling. And actually what the research shows is most people don't treat themselves nearly as well as they treat their close friends. The vast majority of people, if you compare how they treat themselves versus those they care about, they're much kinder to others. I mean, if you ever do this, and I would suggest you do if you haven't done it, take a look at what you say to yourself when you're feeling inadequate or insecure or just when something difficult happens. Like, what type of language do you use? What's your tone of voice with yourself? And ask yourself, would I treat my good friend this way? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's an indication that maybe you can start thinking about, well, what would it look like if I started to treat myself with more kindness and support? So when I decided I wanted to actually research self-compassion, I knew I had to come up with something a little more formal than treating yourself like a good friend. So I did come up with a more formal definition of self-compassion. And it really has 3 core components, and they all have to be there in order for it to be a full self-compassionate mindset. In many ways, this is a mindset. So kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness, and I'll take you through each of these. So mindfulness, and there's been a lot of talk about mindfulness, you've probably had some exposure to it. Mindfulness is actually at the core of self-compassion. We can't have self-compassion unless we are mindful of our own suffering, right? We need to be willing to turn toward it and acknowledge it and see it so that then we can turn toward ourselves and treat ourselves with this warmth and care. So we have to be with our painful feelings as we are. If we fight them and resist them, what we know from psychology is that it actually tends to make things worse. And if we suppress it and avoid it, then we can't open our hearts to ourselves. So we need to be with our painful feelings in the kind of this balanced manner that doesn't suppress them or doesn't run away with them either. And then we need to be kind to ourselves. So once we're aware that we're struggling or that we're suffering or we're feeling badly, we kind of do this act of perspective taking. You know, again, we turn toward ourselves and we treat ourselves with the kindness that we'd show to a good friend. Also, at the end of the day, compassion is a motivation, right? So we know from fMRI research that when people are feeling compassion, the motor cortex gets activated. And that's because compassion is an intention, a desire to alleviate suffering. There's a felt sense of wanting to help. And so again, with self-compassion, there's a felt sense of wanting to help and support ourselves so we can alleviate our suffering. And then the third part of self-compassion that really has to be there is a sense of common humanity. This is actually what differentiates self-compassion from self-pity. Self-pity is poor me. Compassion, by its very nature, is connected. The word in Latin, compassion, passion means to suffer, com means with. Compassion is to suffer with. The difference between having compassion for someone and pity for someone, with pity you look down on them, there's a sense of separation. With compassion, there's a sense of, well, we all struggle, we're all in this together. The same thing with self-compassion. What happens is when we notice we're suffering or we fail in some way, we remember that imperfection and struggle is part of the human condition. Everyone is imperfect, and everyone leads an imperfect life. Now, we know this logically, right? We know this logically, but emotionally, irrationally, especially when we fail or we make a mistake or, you get that phone call from the doctor, there's that sense, the feeling is something has gone wrong. Think about those moments. Something has gone wrong. This isn't supposed to be happening, right? As if what's supposed to be happening is perfection. And what's supposed to be happening is you're getting everything right and nothing difficult is happening in your life. That's a complete fallacy. What's supposed to be happening is we're human beings and we have difficult experiences. We make mistakes and we learn and grow. That's actually what it means to be human. So with self-compassion, it's not self-pity. It's not poor me. It's like, okay, I see. I'm struggling. I'm human. What can I learn from this? How can I grow from this situation? There's also something else about self-compassion that's important to realize is that there's two sides of self-compassion. There's a yin and a yang side. So we're borrowing this from Chinese philosophy. So yin and yang, most people are aware of the concept. These are two essential life force energies. Yin is kind of more of a yielding, passive, soft, feminine energy. Yang is more of a forceful, active, hard, masculine energy. But all people, regardless of gender, have both yin and yang, and the idea is we need both, and they need to be integrated. Self-compassion also has a yin and yang, but most people just think of the yin side of compassion. So yin self-compassion, this is the tender aspect of compassion. This is kind of the nurturing quality of compassion. This is when we can turn toward ourselves in our imperfection, in our struggles, and we can be with ourselves in a compassionate way, kind of soothing ourselves, reassuring ourselves that we aren't alone, validating our pain, treating ourselves like a friend. And the kind of the prototypical metaphor for yin self-compassion is a parent tenderly rocking their crying child. So when we're crying, when we're suffering, we can turn toward ourselves with that same tenderness and help calm and soothe ourselves. But that's only half of self-compassion. Sometimes to alleviate suffering, we need yang. We need to take action. I like to call this fierce self-compassion. So if yin self-compassion is mama, yang self-compassion is mama bear. And by the way, men, you have a mama bear also. Everyone has an internal mama bear. So this is the part of self-compassion that means we need to act to alleviate suffering. Think of a firefighter who goes to a building on fire and has to risk their life to save the people inside from being engulfed in flames. Or think of the parent who works 3 jobs to put food on the table for their kids. Or think of the teacher who pours his or her heart out, motivating their kids to reach their full potential. These are also acts of compassion. And that means we also do this with ourselves. Sometimes self-compassion means saying no, drawing boundaries. That's not okay what I'm doing, or that's not okay what you're doing. I need to protect myself. Sometimes it means protecting ourselves, meeting our own needs instead of just giving and giving or just doing for others. Sometimes saying, if I'm going to care for myself, this is really important to me. I need to take time and energy to meet this need if I'm going to be happy and not suffer. And then also motivating change, right? Sometimes, it's not okay just to be as we are. We accept ourselves as we are, and yet we also need to change often if we want to be happy, because sometimes what we're doing is not making us happy. So these are all various aspects of self-compassion. And Chris especially likes to have people feel things, not just think about things. So yeah, so why don't you take it over and talk about Avalokiteshvara?
Yeah, so this is the god or goddess of compassion. It goes different ways, male or female, depending on where you are in the world. But there are many different hands because compassion has many different expressions. And self-compassion also has many different expressions.
You really can feel compassion in your body, but luckily this isn't just a good idea. This isn't just fun. This isn't just a touchy-feely concept. There's a lot of empirical support about the benefits of self-compassion. So this is a research graph of the research. This is a Google Scholar search of journal articles with self-compassion in the title. So you can see back in 2003, published the theory paper on self-compassion at a scale to measure it. First few years, it was me and my graduate students just, putting out a few papers, and then other people started catching on. And now I can't keep up with the literature. Several articles come out every single day on self-compassion, a huge explosion of research. Since I know there's some researchers here, how do we research self-compassion? A lot of it's done with the self-compassion scale I created way back when, kind of face valid items talking about the presence or the lack of the 3 components of self-compassion. But research is becoming more sophisticated, and now there's more experimental ways to look at self-compassion, so we can actually start to get at causality. So one common way is doing a self-compassion mood induction. We have someone maybe confront some sort of difficulty or induce a failure at something, and we have them write to themselves with the 3 components of self-compassion: mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness, and see how that changes behavior compared to a control group. And then also more and more there are actually intervention studies. What happens when you actually teach people to be more self-compassionate? How does it change their lives? And the bottom line is self-compassion is strongly linked to well-being. And by the way, all 3 methods of looking at self-compassion converge, which is nice. So we get depression, reductions in negative states of mind, things like depression, stress, perfectionism, shame, chronic pain, etc. So basically, self-compassion, when it holds pain, it reduces the pain, it reduces the distress, partly because we aren't fighting it so much, and we're helping ourselves feel safe, so we can hold it, so it reduces the pain. At the same time that it increases positive states of mind, things like happiness, life satisfaction, optimism, gratitude. This is an incomplete list. Immune function. Some research actually shows that it increases physical health. And that's because, self-compassion is kind of special because it's a positive emotion. Compassion feels good. It feels loving, connected, present, but it's aimed at suffering. Right? So it helps to transform suffering in the way that reduces the negative and actually enhances the positive, which is one of the reasons it's so powerful. We have done research comparing self-compassion to self-esteem, and we do find that, again, it has the same benefits. Remember, self-esteem is also good for mental health, but it's not linked to social comparison or narcissism. The sense of self-worth is less contingent, and therefore it's more stable over time. So it's really kind of a healthier way to feel good about ourselves than self-esteem. Oops, sorry. Just say that there's a lot of cultural myths about self-compassion that really stand in the way of people's ability to be more self-compassionate. And luckily, research disproves all of them and actually shows that the truth is actually the opposite of what the myth believes. So one myth is that self-compassion is weak. And basically, I can say, as a researcher, au contraire. Self-compassion is, research shows kind of unequivocally at this point, it's a source of strength, coping, and resilience. It's incredibly powerful for helping us deal with the tough stuff. When the going gets tough, the tough get self-compassionate if they want to stay strong. So for instance, some people are able to cope with things like combat. A lot of research being done with military veterans now, showing that it helps them cope with combat experiences. People getting divorced, dealing with chronic pain, raising special needs children, you name it. If you're going through a stressful, difficult experience, compassion helps you get through. And I like the example of the soldiers. We actually did one study showing that soldiers who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, how compassionate they were to themselves about the traumatic experiences they had, predicted whether or not they developed post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it was actually more powerful than how much action they had seen overseas, right? So more important than how much action you see in terms of if you get PTSD is how did I relate to myself when thinking about that? Was I an inner enemy? Did I feel shame? Did I cut myself down? You know, did I fight against myself, or did I just suppress things? Or was I an ally to myself? Was I, supportive? Was I kind? Was I understanding, patient? And of course, when you go into battle, you're going to be stronger and more successful if you're an inner ally as opposed to an enemy, right? A lot of people think it'll undermine responsibility, right? The dog ate my homework. So again, just the opposite. What we find is that self-compassion leads to greater responsibility. So first of all, you're more able to admit your mistakes because it's safe to do so. You know, when you say, hey, it's human to make mistakes, you can own up to it instead of having to blame other people. It leads to greater efforts to amend transgressions, to say you're sorry and try to fix the situation. And it's actually linked to healthy guilt rather than shame. So guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. If you're full of shame, you actually aren't trying to help repair the situation. But you should feel a little guilty if you've harmed someone. So self-compassion allows you to own it and then do something about it. Probably the biggest block is this belief that it's going to undermine motivation, right? What we find is that self-compassion leads to more motivation. So in terms of the standards, like the goals people set for themselves, they aren't higher, but they aren't lower either. So people who care about themselves are going to want to reach their goals, and just like everyone wants to reach their goals. The big difference is what happens when you don't meet your goals, when you fail to meet your goals. People who are very self-critical, if they really beat themselves up when they fail, they can start developing a fear of failure and performance anxiety, right? So if I try and I'm not going to be able to do it, then I'm afraid, and I might get anxious, and then I might just give up. So self-compassionate people, because it's safe to fail, they have less fear of failure, they have less performance anxiety, they are less likely to do things like procrastinate, because it's okay to try and fail. And then when they do fail, they're more likely to persist in their efforts, they have more grit, and they're more likely to try again after failure. And it also leads to increased self-confidence. So if you think about it, if you're trying to motivate a child to do better on an exam, you aren't going to motivate that, hopefully, try to motivate that child the way you motivate yourself by saying, you good-for-nothing loser, you can't do it, I hate you, right? That's not really going to motivate that child. If you say to yourself the same thing you might say to that child, which is, first of all, hey, it's okay to fail. Everyone fails. It's part of being human. But what can we learn from this experience? How can we grow from this experience? That type of supportive attitude is much more likely to yield healthy motivation. Yes. And then why don't I pass it over to Chris? I'm going to talk about how this might be relevant for leaders, since you guys are at a School of Business.
Yeah, so we're at the Ross Business School, and you probably were wondering, what does this have to do with what I do or want to do? And so Kristin has nicely summarized there that the self-compassion provides resilience in the face of challenges, and in any work environment we're going to have challenges all day long, hopefully. It decreases stress and burnout, and the way it does that is the same way a hug from somebody will comfort you and give you the courage to go on. If you can give yourself that same kind of kindness, it'll motivate you. It allows us to see our mistakes clearly and learn from them. I'll cite a study about that in just a moment. And it increases wisdom, flexibility, creativity, and flexible thinking. So these are all, we have clear evidence for that in the research. But what's ironic is that I did my homework before coming to the Ross Business School and looked at, okay, what's the research, the empirical research on self-compassion in work and business settings, and I found literally 2 articles. And they're kind of small articles. However, there's a wonderful article in the Harvard Business Review in the September-October issue of 2018 by Serena Chen, in which she describes some of the self-compassion research that's particularly relevant to work and business environments. And so what I'd like to do is to just summarize what she writes in this article, and I encourage you to get a hold of it if you like. But what's interesting is the take-home message that she offers. She says that nowadays in the business environment there's a lot of conversation about failure and how failure really is a essential part of innovation, and so in the business field, we've kind of got that down. But what self-compassion adds to the story is how actually to make failure redemptive. In other words, how actually to grow and thrive in an environment where failure is endemic, and that is by cultivating the resource of self-compassion. So she makes a few points. The first is that organizations want to improve, and the way to improve as individuals within an organization is to have a realistic self-assessment. And as Kristin was saying earlier, if we are not self-compassionate, if we are, for example, narcissistic, we are likely to have an inflated sense of self. And also, if we're not self-compassionate and things go wrong, we're likely to beat up on ourselves mercilessly. A kind of sense of inflation or self-criticism is not accurate. Self-compassion actually allows us to settle down and to see the way things are more accurately. Secondarily, as Kristin mentioned, self-compassion helps us to recover from setbacks and to work harder to improve after making mistakes. But perhaps the most interesting thing that Serena Chen points out in this article, which really summarizes her work, as well as the work by Jia Zhang and Juliana Breens, is growth mindset. So what she finds is that self-compassion enhances growth mindset. And what they did is they did a clever thing. They did a study in which they had 3 groups, and and they asked people to reflect on their biggest weakness. So, for example, it might be shyness or insecurity or, vulnerability to negative feedback or something like that. She had them reflect on that, and then she had 3 groups, one in which one group wrote a compassionate response to themselves in light of this weakness. Another, the group wrote, a note to themselves about their positive qualities. So one was a self-compassion intervention, one was a self-esteem intervention, you're great, what are you worrying about? And then the third was they didn't write anything. And then shortly after that, they asked the same participants, have they ever done anything, or are they doing anything to overcome that weakness? And also, where do they think the weakness came from? And those are measures of growth mindset. Growth mindset is when we can see our potential and actually do something to improve. That's growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. And she found that the experimental self-compassion group was most associated with the growth mindset. So just writing a letter to ourselves in a compassionate way stimulates the idea that actually we are not fixed in this condition and we can grow. And then the next question is, does self-compassion actually lead to behavior change, particularly when things go wrong? So they did a really interesting study by giving students a really tough vocabulary test in which everybody kind of did really poorly. And then again, they had different instructions. And in one instruction, they did compassion intervention, which is, that test is hard for everybody, and people also do feel bad about it, but you have what it takes. And the other intervention was a self-esteem intervention, which basically was, you're really smart. You wouldn't have gotten into this prestigious university if it weren't so. And then afterwards, they gave a second vocabulary test and gave people an opportunity to study for it or not. And they found that people who were given the self-compassion intervention, which is, it was a tough test and you did poorly, I feel bad about it, but, you're not alone. Those people worked much harder than the ones who heard, you're super smart, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You get it? So this is an example for what Kristin was saying about how self-compassion actually increases our motivation to recover from failure or mistakes. And that's also part of growth mindset, this working toward, higher potential. And then the last thing they studied was authenticity. And authenticity refers to living your life in a way congruent with your values and your needs and your personality. And Zia Zhang led a study in which they asked people to rate in short surveys every day their self-compassion. In other words, was I kind to myself today? She also asked them to rate their authenticity each day, which was, I felt genuine in my interaction with others, or the work I did felt, congruent with my values. And she found that those two measures were highly correlated. That is to say, people who were high in self-compassion were also high in authenticity. So what does this have to do with leadership? Well, the research also shows that leaders with the growth mindset are more likely to see the potential and to give helpful feedback to their subordinates. In other words, I have a growth mindset. I believe in my own potential. I see your potential. I will help you to move toward your potential. So therefore, it's good for leaders to be self-compassionate because it helps support growth mindset. Secondarily, authentic leaders, the research shows, promote a culture of authenticity in the workplace. So self-compassion supports authenticity, it supports growth mindset, and if leaders cultivate this in themselves, they will quite naturally in relationship bring it into the organizational, their organizational behavior. Okay? So, I'm going to speak really briefly about shame, and then we're going to do a little exercise for 5 minutes, and then we'll have another 5 minutes for conversation. So these three components, self-criticism, common humanity, and mindfulness, The opposites, which is self-criticism, sense of isolation, and ruminating, are actually 3 qualities of shame. And when we say that in the workplace and in life in general, people with high self-compassion thrive and also have less negative quality of life, what we're really saying in part is that people are living with less shame. So what is shame? Already, Kristin said, guilt is I did something wrong, shame is I am wrong. So what happens is when things go wrong in our lives, we can either step back a bit and see it as an objective problem, or we can attack ourselves or others when things go wrong. And when we do that, there's the elephant in the room is actually shame. And if self-compassion is anything, it is an antidote to shame. 30 years from now, in my field, I'm a clinical psychologist, when they say, oh, you know, what was self-compassion good for? Surely we're going to say it was an antidote to shame. And we feel shame all day long in tiny little ways that we hardly recognize. You know, little assaults to the self. But shame technically means, it's about sense of inadequacy, but shame technically means I am imagining in my mind what you are imagining about me. It's a social emotion. So following what Kristin was saying, what if our self-worth doesn't come from what you think about me, but kindness toward myself when things go wrong? So that's the mechanism by which self-compassion undermines shame. But what I'd like you to do now, with that as a background, is we're going to do a little exercise, if you're willing. I'd like you to think about, in the last month, some failure that you experienced or a sense of inadequacy. Some failure or inadequacy, and make it like 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. We don't want to blow you away with 5 minutes left in this little talk, you know. Can you think of some failure, sense of inadequacy? And it could be, you know, you picked up ballroom dancing and, you know, you just can't seem to find your way across the floor, you know, or maybe you didn't do so well in a test, or maybe you had to give a presentation and it didn't go like you expected. Can you think of something? Please raise your hand if you need a little more time to think of one. Okay, so listen, first of all, we're all united in common humanity with that, right? We already got one. So I'd like you to close your eyes for a second. I'd like you to visualize that situation. And kind of feel your way into it enough that you can feel the discomfort of it. Like, I really don't want to be thinking about this. Okay, and now I'd like you to validate for yourself that this, what you're feeling right now, is a moment of stress, a moment of discomfort. This is painful. Like right now, thinking about this, feeling in my body, this is painful. It hurts. It really hurts. It hurts to be in a situation like this. And second, I'd like you to consider that anybody in this situation, probably just about anybody in the same situation, would also feel the same hurt. The story might be different, but the feeling quite similar. That actually, we're not alone when we feel like this. That the person to the left of you and the right of you or in front of you right now probably feels quite similar. That actually having failures and moments of inadequacy is a part of living. So just feeling for a moment the humanity of mistakes and failing and feeling inadequate. This is part of the human condition. And now, finally, imagine that you had a dear friend who went through exactly what you had to endure. The same grade on the test, the same flub, the same embarrassment. Dear friend, and you had just a moment with your friend, and heart to heart you were going to say something to him. You want to say something to your friend. Just have a moment. What would you say to your friend? You know how they're suffering. You know what this is like. So in your own heart and mind, offer your friend right now some words of kindness, comfort, support, encouragement. And now just take one little snippet of that conversation. You can see where this is going. And maybe put your heart over your hand and just over your hand over heart over your hand, your hand over your heart, and just offer yourself right now those same words. Maybe even using your name. Validating the pain. Knowing you're not alone. Some words of kindness. Whispering those own words into your ear. And notice that how it feels when you do that. Take it in. You know, sometimes the door of the heart's a little closed for this. It's not so easy to practice self-compassion. This is called the SelfCompassion Break. See if you can just take a break and let it in, if only for this one moment. Okay, so now you can release the practice, and you can slowly open your eyes. Okay, so that's the self-compassion break. Can self-compassion be taught? The answer is yes. You can increase self-compassion by practicing yoga, by getting a dog, by taking the mindful self-compassion training program, all kinds of things. Our program, as was mentioned earlier, it's now 100,000 people. There's a program called SelfCompassion at Work, and Weibo Kola developed this. He's a guy who works with Otto Scharmer at MIT, and he's also a leader in mindful leadership, a pioneer in mindful leadership in Europe. And he and I are going to do a week-long training in California on this. If anybody's interested, there's some flyers over there. But this is based on the job demands and resources model. So what we're doing in this program is looking at the demands, but meeting it with the resources of mindfulness and compassion. And if anybody wants to know more, that's where you can